Good afternoon and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series we interview members of the SMU community who have provided insight into the history of the university, and we particularly welcome this afternoon Schubert Ogden, Distinguished University Professor Emeritus, member of the Perkins faculty, almost continuously from 1956 to the early 90s?
1993.
93.
Right.
And we're delighted to have you back on campus, Schubert.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
I referred to almost continuously because you were at the University of Chicago from 1969 to 72.
That's right.
Good. And we were delighted to have you return.
Yes, it was good for me too.
Well, let's start and do a little reflective conversation first. What was Perkins like, Perkins School of Theology like when you first arrived?
Mm-hmm. Well, I first arrived when I came down to candidate for the job, and my mentors at the University of Chicago had been somewhat anxious about my coming because they had an image of the Bible Belt and the buckle thereon that led them to suspect that maybe there would be some incongruity between the university here and yours truly. And they cautioned me to look this place over very, very carefully. Well, I'm happy to say that from the time I first set foot on the campus at SMU and was hosted by Dean Cunningham and some of his senior colleagues on the faculty, notably Joe Quillian, who succeeded him in the deanship then a few years later. From that time on, I felt very much as if I were a part of the community, and that was basically the ground tone of my life experience here and all the time I was here. There was an enormous sense of excitement in the school in the years in the mid-50s. A number of younger faculty had been recently appointed to positions in the faculty. Distinguished Professor Albert Outler had come to the faculty, and his presence here, together with some of these younger colleagues, gave promise of an exciting time together. And so from the beginning, it was an interesting experience.
Well, it must have been, and in some senses, Perkins sat as the leader in a university that was not perhaps as far along in its maturing process as the seminary was.
So it was said at the time, and I think so it was generally believed by anyone who was knowledgeable of the situation, that there were certain possibilities that the School of Theology, largely through the generosity of its benefactors, had certain advantages, and it had an opportunity to break out and to explore new possibilities that were not necessarily present in other parts of the university at that time. And I think those opportunities were well taken advantage of by the dean and his senior colleagues. They knew how to use opportunities when they were given them. And the result was that within a relatively short period of time, the School of Theology became a very different place from what it had been theretofore. Not that there were not important continuities, because there were. There were many senior colleagues who were from the older Perkins who were retained well beyond my coming, with some of whom I was closely befriended. Fred Gailey, for example, was a very dear friend of mine, and there were others on the older faculty with whom I had a very close working relationship, and I think that was true of all the younger of us. So that there was not within the school a division. Mm-hmm. The division tended to be more between the Perkins that was in the process of being born and the kind of threats that it seemed to pose to some. There was that clash that was a thing. And so there were tensions also, especially with some of the churches in the region, and those tensions were real. They did not disappear during Merriman Cunningham's deanship. In fact, one of Joe Quillian's first and most important senses of duty when he became dean was to try to mend fences that he suspected had been unnecessarily broken during that more revolutionary period.
Well, it always seems to be the case, and we can look at other schools around the campus at later dates that went through the same kind of fracturing and rehealing, and we can talk about that later if we have time. Who were some of the colleagues? You've mentioned Fred Gailey and Joe Quillian. Who were some of the other colleagues that were here when you joined the faculty, or came shortly thereafter?
Yeah. Already on the faculty, younger colleagues who had come just before my coming was Edward Hobbs, who was teaching in New Testament studies. And he was a close friend, a close personal friend, and we worked together. In those days, it was possible to, if you wanted to work harder and at no extra pay, you could offer special courses in things that you were particularly interested in. And Edward had done some serious work, as I had done, in the relationship between Christian faith and contemporary art forms. And so we devised together a course that we taught, as I say, on our own. It was a senior seminar that we taught, and so that kind of collaboration became possible, and it was great fun. Robert Elliott was teaching at that time in the pastoral counseling area. Bob had been a student at the University of Chicago, where I also had done my graduate studies, and I had known him, but not well, and we became then much closer when I came here. I've mentioned Fred Gailey, who of the older faculty was the person with whom I had the closest personal relationship. He was a splendid teacher, marvelous musician, had wide sympathies, Catholic tastes. He was the kind of person from whom you can learn so much if you have the opportunity to be, around him.
And two sons who were geologists.
Two sons who were geologists, not to mention a daughter-in-law who was one too.
That's right. Excuse me, Schubert, I interrupted you. But
No, that's fine. No, that's exactly, we're talking about the same man. But he was a wonderful colleague, and then very early on, I think it was indeed my second year on the faculty that I was asked to serve on an ad hoc committee to appoint a person in music who would have some kind of joint relationship with the music school and then also with the School of Theology. And the person who came was Lloyd Foundation. And Fred Gailey and I were both on that subcommittee or whatever it was, and I can remember from the time that we first met Lloyd Foundation how excited we were about the prospects of his coming, and I must say it was one of the best things that ever happened because he proved to be an admirable colleague in every way. He did incredible service to the School of Theology in originating all sorts of programs from which the school still benefits, and then on into the university.
Equally in the art school as well as the university beyond.
Exactly. He was an absolutely marvelous
colleague.
He had a sense of professionalism.
Yes.
That was as acute but as unpretentious as any such sense as I've ever known. He was very scrupulous about his own work and craftsmanship, and yet at the same time he was not in any way incapable of overlooking the mistakes of others and getting on with the job. But he was a wonderful man.
And had a wonderful sense of humor.
Oh yes, just tremendous. So.
He was a dear colleague for, I think, everyone who had the good fortune to work with him in any capacity in the university. I think we all felt that way.
I think so.
Well, moving on, you, as I recall, you have worked with 3 deans in the Perkins School of Theology, starting with Merriman Cunningham, who I think had come immediately following World War II in the late 40s. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mustn't be relied on here because I'm not good at such things, but it seemed to me that it was like 49, 50 along in there. It was fairly late in the 40s. All I remember is the anecdote that was told about Humphrey Lee and Dean Cunningham and the Perkins is going to Yale to visit it. You probably
No,
know
I
this
haven't.
tale. And they looked at the Yale campus, which is Georgian in architecture and a very beautiful campus, and certainly at that time was at its best. The story goes, I have no way to know whether this is apocryphal or true, but it's a wonderful story. Mr. Perkins is supposed to have said to Chancellor Lee, how much do you suppose it would take to reproduce this down on the plains of North Texas? And the Chancellor was, or President Lee at that time, evidently gave some kind of figure, and Mr. Perkins is reputed to have said, well, I think we can handle that.
That's a wonderful story.
and they did. I mean,
Perkins ended up with a magnificent part of the campus.
Exactly. And that was, the fact that there could be such a marvelous physical plant in which this beginning could take place was a very important part of the morale of the community and its sense of, going ahead. And I think Dean Cunningham, on the other hand, was a person who knew how to, as I said before, take advantage of opportunities of this kind. And he set about exploiting the contacts that he had with some people like Albert Outler, and began to secure what in his mind was the kind of faculty that gave promise of making the Perkins School of Theology, as it then came to be called, a school that would be worthy of the university.
And he certainly accomplished that.
And I think he did the hard work of getting that foundation
that first
laid.
Building, yes.
That's right. And in all sorts of other ways. Internally, I think all of us who lived through that period would agree that democracy was at something of a premium in the faculty. Decisions were taken somewhat unilaterally by what some of us thought were the right standards, but they were effectively taken, and much of the progress that we made was made in those very early times. But then there was an openness to new people coming in and becoming full participants in the process. That was the thing, I think, that made it exciting. So all of us who came in felt that we belonged here. We didn't feel outside or part of something alien. It was something that we had a chance to participate in and to take responsibility for.
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed, my wife and I enjoyed when I was in Central University Administration, the Perkins faculty was always very gracious in inviting us to come to all of your social functions, and those were some of the pleasanter things that went along with being provost. But you didn't have to be there long to sense the colleagueship that was, by then it was a way of life at Perkins.
That's right. And I think here is one of the I mentioned before continuities, from the older Perkins to the newer one. I think there had been a tradition all along of close colleagueship and family participation in the life of the school. And there was a very active Perkins Wives group at that time. And I think that the sense of belonging to a community that all of us felt as faculty and as faculty spouses was a very important ingredient in the morale of our operation. And most of us, I think, remember those days with affection. They were good days.
Of course.
People cared for one another way beyond official limits.
Exactly.
Including staff persons who would show up on your back porch the day you brought your wife home from the hospital with the first baby with a gorgeous pecan pie.
Yeah.
Which I will never forget. Things like that. I mean,
of course.
There was that kind of almost familial friendliness.
It was an enlarged faculty. That was my sense of it, and I always thought that was special because that's the only place in the university that I know of that existed to that level.
Right.
Well, you know, Merriman, I remember two things about Merriman, and I won't take a lot of time. One was in those days, the opening faculty meeting was an opportunity in the fall, was the opportunity for all the deans to introduce new faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And Merriman always had a contest with Dean Story in the School of Law as to who could be most flamboyant in their introductions, and they were pretty impressive.
Yes.
The other recollection I have of Merriman was much later. He had by then gone on to the Danforth Foundation, and when Paul Hardin came as president, we decided to invite a commencement speaker rather than having the president of the university give the commencement address. And we thought, well, we could invite Merriman because the hazard always is that it runs too long. Mm-hmm. And Merriman was a person we could talk with, so we invited Merriman, and I said, now Merriman, you know, we're really talking about 20 minutes, maybe 25 at the max. 47 and a half minutes later. But he was happy to be home, and we were happy to have him.
Yeah, right.
Well, he laid a wonderful foundation for the new Perkins, as you described it.
He did indeed.
And he was followed by Joe Quillian.
By Joe Quillian, who was, he was the hardest working, day in, day out, nose to the grindstone academic administrator that I have ever known. If anyone, through sheer effort, deserves credit for the what's happened at the School of Theology, it seems to me he above all does. He was an assiduous worker. I mean, he simply worked all the time. And he and I used to commonly, at that time with very small children at home, I didn't have a study there, and I did all of my writing and so on in the office in the university. And on Saturdays, he and I were the two people who could find one another and go have lunch together. But always he was there, and his desk is legendary for, you would walk into his office and it was heaped with all of the things that he was in some touch with, but not yet on top of. But he was a hard worker, and he labored at nothing so much as the task of trying to overcome what he believed, and I also believed, were false tensions and strains between the church generally and the School of Theology, to try to make clear that the mission of the school was a distinct mission. It was not the church's mission, and yet at the same time it was there to serve the church, and that was taken not just verbally, but with the kind of seriousness that was backed up by deeds. And he worked at that so hard. But anyway, I have the highest respect for him as a colleague.
Well, to support what you just said, early in his deanship, in fact, I think almost right away, there was a columnist for the Dallas Morning News at that time named Lynn Landrum, who for whom Perkins was a favorite target.
Right.
And one of Joe's very early actions was to take Lynn out to lunch, and there was never a deleterious column after that.
Yes, and that followed upon, as you also, I'm sure, will recall, an exceedingly strained period in which Mr. Landrum and Merriman Cunningham exchanged salvos with one another.
Yes.
in the Dallas Morning News, and that was an unhappy time, and it was against the background of that tension that Joe Quillian was bound and determined that he was going to put an end to that kind of thing, and he did, and it, as you say, it worked.
It worked effectively, and I'm sure in many other arenas. That's one that I happen to know about personally.
Right.
But Joe was remarkable, and I valued him a great deal as I came to know him, because he was not only Dean of Perkins, which he did with, I think, signal success, but he was very much a citizen of the university.
Right.
And there are sometimes points when a provost or a president feels the need to call some support, and there were two deans that I knew I could always rely on to be university before they were school, and Joe was one of them.
Right.
And I valued that enormously.
Right. Yeah, I think in that respect, as in so many others, he was primus inter pares in our faculty. He represented us. We knew that he had that university first kind of mind.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was zealous in his defense of what he took to be the interests of the School of Theology.
Absolutely.
If he thought those were in any way threatened. But he at the same time recognized that what makes Perkins School of Theology distinctive and gives it its opportunity to be the place that he wanted it and worked so hard to make it, wanted it to be, is the fact that it belongs to the university. It is not a freestanding school, as important as those can be in their own way, but they're not as valuable in his mind or in mine as the university-related School of Theology. And it was the need to maintain that relationship as well as the relationship with the church. That was Joe's project, but it was precisely because he was so intent upon Perkins being a part of the university.
And being an effective part.
Exactly. And effective meant, in his mind, participating in in the life and work of the rest of the university. That faculty from our theological faculty should participate actively in the larger academic citizenship of the campus. That was for Joe, that had a high premium on it.
Well, it was, you referred to his advocacy of Perkins. Having been through 9 budget conferences with Joe, I can assure you that he was an active and assertive advocate for the school, as he should have been.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's in a way what one has to say he got paid for.
That's right.
That was his job. Right, but that was not at the price of a kind of,
no,
that's the point you made, and I think you're dead right about that.
Well, there's one other small anecdote about Quillian. Of course, he was famous for his mandalas that were produced, and every meeting he went to, he had his sketch pad with him.
That's right.
And he very graciously gave my first daughter one as a wedding present, and that was just the way Joe was.
Yes, it was, and they were exceedingly well made.
Yes, they were.
Yes, that was wonderful. I can hardly remember him in a faculty meeting, after he did his thing, so to speak, as dean, when he was simply we were receiving committee reports or whatever. I can remember a time when he didn't have the pipe in one side of his mouth and his pen in his hand doing
That's
a
right.
mandala. I mean,
that's right.
That was typically the posture in which you found him, and it seemed somehow so appropriate. It
fitted Joe.
The man. That's right.
That's right. Well, it was interesting because in those days the deans attended Board of Governors meetings, and Joe really caused massive vexation with the people, the 1 or 2 people who would be chairing the meeting, because here was this litany of putting the cap on the pen, taking the pipe out of the mouth, and then saying, "Now, Mr. Chairman, back on item 2."
That's right. In that inimitable Georgia drawl.
That's right.
That's right. That's right.
Well, you also you worked with the 3rd dean. We can talk more about Joe down the road if we have time, because we could both tell Quillian stories till the world looks level.
Right. That's right.
But Joe was succeeded by Jim Kirby.
Yes.
And that was in the late 79 or 80, along in there.
I believe our search committee did its work in 79 and 80, and I think Jim Kirby began his deanship in the academic year 80-81. Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And then Jim continued, interrupted by his stint as president ad interim.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes, in the first seminar that I taught at Perkins when I came to the faculty in 1956, in those days, the senior year was set aside for the 3rd year in the seminarian's 3-year curriculum was set aside for specialized courses called seminars, and students elected these. There was no requirements at that 3rd stage. All the required courses came before, and in an elective course that I taught my very first semester, one of the students in the class was Jim Kirby. And
that I did not know. That's interesting.
So we have known one another from that moment, and I've always had the highest regard for him as a man, as a student. He was a fine student. He did good work, and like many of the students who came to the School of Theology in the 50s and 60s, there was it was the diamond in the rough thing. In his case, he was much more polished already than many who came to us. But there was an incredible ability that you sensed in the students, much more so than later on. There was an enormous amount of potential, and he, together with several other men in that graduating class, who were seniors that my first year, all had distinguished contributions then to make to the United Methodist Church in one way or another. He through an educational ministry, and we followed one another around all through the years, and I was often on the campus at Sweetbriar when he taught there as his guest essentially, and to lecture and that sort of thing. And then when he went to Drew as dean, I also had occasion to be there more than once during his deanship. And I have, through all of that, I have always thought of him very highly. And when he came to us, it was with great excitement. And I think that his deanship was an attempt really to build on the accomplishments of both of his predecessors, but especially Joe Quillian. And then to reckon with the fact that we were nearing that millennium, and that there was a new, perhaps even a third Perkins that needed to be born, and as it came to be called then finally. And these were stormy waters because there were different judgments within the faculty. There were different sensibilities present in the student body about what the school should be. That's basically what was going on. And to have ridden herd over that, or if I get all of my metaphors mixed up, to have supervised that stormy process and to have come out as effectively as it seemed to me things did at the end of Jim Kirby's deanship, I think that was an accomplishment, and that was hard work.
Well, that is hard work.
Yes, it is.
Because you're crafting, you're keeping the ship moving on the one hand, but you're redirecting its course on another, and that requires two different kinds of thinking sometimes.
That's right. It does indeed. And there had been sea changes in all sorts of ways in the larger academic culture, the larger ecclesial or church culture. There were lots of changes that had taken place in connection with the upheavals in our country generally in the late 60s and 70s. And then into the 80s, there were enough changes had happened that you couldn't just do things the old way. There had to be accommodation made to new ways of doing things. And with the prospect of new faculty and a newer generation of students, there was nothing to do but to change. The problem was how to do that so as to maintain the identity that the school had acquired and the quality that it had. That it could, I think, rightfully boast of.
Well, now let's explore that a little bit. These were, I take it, changes both in the faculty and in the curriculum.
Yes.
And I think it might be kind of interesting if you would like to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, it lies in the nature of professional education of all kinds, as I have had any experience with it, that the professional school is rightly identified as essentially a service institution with respect to the profession for which it educates persons to be professionals. The problem is that if the professional school is to do its proper job, my understanding, and this was the understanding of Merriman Cunningham and Joe Quillian certainly, and I think Jim Kirby shares it. To do that job, there has to be an independence between the school and the profession it serves. It cannot directly serve the profession without failing to serve it. It can serve the profession effectively if and only if it has a certain freedom. And in the case of the School of Theology and the church, that freedom is always a threat to many people. They feel that the School of Theology should produce preachers, okay? And the preachers should be, law-abiding members of conferences. They should not cause any more disturbance or trouble than so on. But from the standpoint of their professional education, while they're not educated to cause trouble, they are educated to do the job that they are professionally trained to do.
Exactly.
And that can sometimes mean rocking the boat, as one says, or acting in ways that cause a certain amount of uncertainty and discontent on the part of local church authorities and leaders. And so that tension is always there. Now, what happens is there is a constant rhythm then. I mean, you have periods in which one side of that is, and in the 1980s, we passed into a period of time when it was very easy for, if I can put it this way, the church side of that balance to get heavy. At the same time, leadership in the churches was falling into the hands of a younger generation, where issues having to do with inclusiveness of church communities, diversity of persons, these issues all were becoming very, very important, as they were indeed also in academic culture. That is to say, the increasing need to have more and more ethnic groups represented on the faculty as well as in the student body of the university, to have positions of leadership in the administration of the university open to women and persons of ethnic minority groups. All of these kinds of changes were in the process of happening at the same time. And for some colleagues in the School of Theology, some faculty persons, their image of what the School of Theology ought to be, now this I have to put from my standpoint, and I don't want to put it any more prejudicially than that requires, but what I want to say is this. They tend, in my judgment, to see the service role of the School of Theology as too direct a service and not sufficiently indirect, so that there's a tendency for the school to get assimilated to the church rather than to retain its proper independence of the church. And what happens is many of my colleagues, younger colleagues particularly, had a vision of the School of Theology in which its mission was not, first of all, and fundamentally theological education of the highest quality. Its mission was, as they would sometimes put it in terms that seemed to me to do justice to their vision, its mission was to model, if you will, the future church, the church that was aborning, to, in its community life, the School of Theology's community life, in its worship, as well as in its classes and so on, to model what the church ought to look like in the 21st century. It was that sort of thing. And I would be the first to say that any modeling that can be done to help the church find ways of imaginatively realizing itself under new conditions, that's always to be welcome. But the primary mission of the School of Theology is to do and to teach theology. And that, in my judgment, we were in danger of not doing at the level at which we are called to do it as we had been doing it. And that was that basically was, as I see it, was the issue over which, as I put it somewhat indelicately, Jim Kirby had to preside as dean. And toward the end of his deanship and of my tenure as a member of the faculty, the waters were rough, and feelings became hurt. There was more nearly a division within our community than I had ever experienced in the
your community being the Perkins.
The Perkins community, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
you know, we spoke at the beginning
right.
about how it was almost familial in character. That was strained to the point where there weren't two faculties, but well, for all practical purposes.
Yeah, anybody who's ever been on a faculty that is worth its salt goes through periods like that, where there are fundamental issues that tend to maybe polarize is too strong a verb, but certainly to cause people to fall into positions of difference.
Right. Exactly.
And that is what I hear you describing.
That's right. And when there are high values at stake on both sides, it's always a difficult time, and it's bound to be hard on both sides.
So the curriculum then inevitably in those years, Cunningham, Quillian, Kirby,
Right.
Had to evolve in response to not only
Exactly.
its own intellectual activities, but the external needs expressed by the church community at large.
Exactly, and the founding of Perkins's away from campus, and those efforts, all efforts that were welcomed, I think, by and large by the church side, those all at the same time raise fundamental questions about the use of resources, faculty time, effort, and so on, for that purpose instead of for other purposes that have traditionally been important for the university faculty.
Well, now this segment of the conversation is really related to largely, as I understand it, to the Methodist Church.
Right.
But you've been, and to my knowledge, Perkins has always been ecumenical in its approach in terms of its student body and its faculty, actually, because you had, among others, Levi Olin was a member of your faculty
That's
for
right.
many years.
That's right. Yes, indeed. And but your observation is exactly mine. One of the things that from the beginning of my own experience of Perkins that was reassuring over against the anxieties of my teachers in Chicago was that, as you say, when I came here, there were Episcopalians and Congregationalists and disciples of Christ, and by no means were all these people Methodists, and by no means were all of them Methodists of a certain kind. They were a diverse lot, and they were denominationally and even confessionally different, because within a relatively short time after I came here, Roman Catholic students were applying for admission to the graduate program in religion. We had Roman Catholic colleagues seeking to do their sabbatical here, and so that our community enjoyed a kind of ecumenical life all along. And one of the persons who has to be mentioned in this connection, as in so many others that are good for the school, was Albert Outler, because his close contact with the Roman Catholic community and his participation in the Second Vatican Council, one of the few Protestant participants who could speak Latin, with the best of them. He had enormous contacts in the Roman Catholic community that were enriching to the School of Theology in all sorts of ways, in the students who came to us, in occasional lecturers and visiting persons who came to us and all that sort of thing. But it was not only the Roman Catholic connection, as you say. We had a close relationship with the Reformed Jewish community in Dallas through Temple Emmanuel and its chief rabbi for all those years. And that continued to some extent even after his leaving that rabbinate and Jack Bemperod's coming to the position. Jack also had a close relation to the school. So that we've always had that kind of an ecumenical community.
One of the things that in introducing friends from other places to the SMU community and talking about Perkins, I've always made the point that we've just been talking about, that it was ecumenical, and this has always, or almost always, been a point of considerable interest, because to people who don't know, and understandably, it has perhaps been viewed as a Methodist seminary.
Yeah, sure.
And
well, Methodist is our middle name.
That's right.
That's
well,
right.
Now, in addition to the seminary, you were involved in most of your time here, in fact, probably all of your time here, in the graduate program in religion. And let's talk a little bit about that, when it was founded, why it was founded, and you mentioned Albert Outler, and clearly he played a key role in that.
Yes. I think it's fair to say that from the beginning of Merriman Cunningham's deanship and the close collaboration between him and Albert Outler in envisaging how the school could and should look and how it should be built, the kind of steps that needed to be taken, there was a recognition that if they were to have the kind of school that they envisaged, it would be important to have faculty who were able to teach not only at the graduate professional level, represented in those days by the Baccalaureate of Divinity degree, but also to teach at in the graduates level, represented by the PhD degree. That you can't keep a good faculty together if it doesn't have the opportunity for graduate work. That was the basic insight. And with that in mind, from an early time, the hope was, and then the plans followed that hope, there would be a graduate program. And early on in Joe Quillian's deanship, he had the great good, he worked very hard at trying to secure the financial support for such a program, because it was clear at the time that the initiatives for establishing the program would have to come from the School of Theology, though there was sympathy with and collaboration in planning the program on the part of colleagues in the university, notably Carl Albritton,
right,
who participated in these early plans.
He was graduate dean at that.
He was dean of the graduate programs in the university at that time. And the resources that were necessary to underwrite the program, Joe Quillian secured through a very generous grant that has enabled the graduate program from that time until now, so far as I know, to continue and to do its work.
And that was the Lloyd?
The Lloyd Foundation, right. I'm sorry, I can't any longer remember the full proper name of Mr. Lloyd, Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd, because after Mr. Lloyd's death, Mrs. Lloyd continued her generous support of the program in all sorts of ways. In any case, that foundation was what made it possible. So in the mid-1960s, and here again, forgive me for being so uncertain about this, but when I ceased to be director of the graduate program, I left all of the papers pertaining to its history with my successor for the archives, and I have not had a chance to remind myself of these details. But it was somewhere about 1965, 6, something in there. The graduate program was launched, and we had, I think our first PhD degrees were awarded to students in that program in 1970. And there were 2, as I remember, who received their degrees in 1970, who had come into the program at the very beginning. And from that time until my retirement, there had been 46 PhDs given to students in the graduate program in religious studies. That's from 1970 to 1993, that's a 23-year period. So 2 a year on an average for 23 years. Most of the students came to us either having already earned a theology degree elsewhere and then came here to do the PhD degree, or some of our own students who had earned their BD degrees, or the MTH degree as it later came to be called, came into the program. And as I mentioned, there were students from other schools, denominations, and the like that came into it. The faculties, from the beginning, theoretically, the program was to be a program in the humanistic study of religion, as distinct from theology. And that meant that it was a program that was properly housed in the School of Arts and Sciences. That was the humanities and sciences. And that was the difficulty, as it were, right along, because you had the money in the School of Theology to provide the support for it, and you had a program, the concept of which puts it in the arts and sciences. Yeah. So that was always the sort of the tension with its existence.
But I think because of the collegial relationship between the two deans involved at that time, Dean Quillian and Dean Albritton, that was never allowed to become a major problem.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I don't think that was ever the problem was more at the problem of the workaday level of involving faculty on both sides, that is both in the Department of Religion, as it was then called, or Department of Religious Studies, as it later came to be called in the college, and the School of Theology faculty, involving members of both teams in the graduate instruction.
Yeah. Now we're both, I suspect that just because of the sizes of the relative faculties, there would have been more Perkins faculty involved in that program than H&S faculty.
That's correct, and in the earliest period of the program's life, from roughly the mid-60s until it was reconstituted in 1975-76, in that early period, it was overwhelmingly taught by theologians.
Yeah.
All right. And there were relatively limited teaching on the part of colleagues elsewhere. After the reconception of the program in 75-76, there was much more nearly a balance. And that program was conceived so that the initial discipline that all students in the program are required to take, a marvelous course called the Course Seminar in Religious Studies, that was taught equally by theologians and by persons in the Department of Religious Studies. Mm-hmm. That is to say, the same number of people. Characteristically, there would be.
Who were some of the faculty people involved in this?
The person who, above all, in the Department of Religious Studies became involved in the planning and conception of the program was Lonnie Cleaver, whose participation in it from that time on was always wholehearted, and he taught year after year in the Course Seminar in Religious Studies and participated also at other levels in committees and dissertation work and that sort of thing. The other person in the department who was very much a part of it was Fred String, who before his untimely death was very much active in the teaching in the Department of Religious Studies.
Well, now you had administrative responsibility for it for quite a while. Who were the other faculty leaders of the program? We've mentioned Albert Outler.
Yes, but of course Albert then retired in 1975, just at the time that this program was reconceived so that it fit more nearly the ideal that he had had in mind from the beginning. So he did not play much of a role in that part of the his role in the graduate program had been in the period from roughly the mid-60s till his retirement in 74. And, 75 I think it was his retirement. He did, however, supervise at least, I think, 3 or 4 students in the PhD degree in the time that he was in the program. Other faculty who were actively involved in it right from the start were Bill Babcock, who, along with Fred String and Lonnie Cleaver and myself, formed the committee that reconceived the whole program in 75-76. And Babcock then, when I ceased to be director in 1990, he took over that responsibility, and except for his time in the central administration of the university, has been at it ever since. Yeah. And
early on, Van Harvey.
Yes.
At the very beginning,
Van Harvey, whom I, for odd reasons, have not mentioned at all, I think, today, though he was one of the younger colleagues who came early on to the faculty at Perkins. He became the first chairperson of what became the graduate program in religious studies, and served in that role until his leaving the university to go to the University of Pennsylvania in 1968. Yeah.
Well, that program has been one of the accomplishments of the Perkins faculty and the university together that I think is not as well known as it deserves to be, and I'm delighted that we've been able to talk about it here because I think it deserves that kind of recognition. Let's move on, Schubert, before we run out of time. As we said in our conversation on the phone the other day, Perkins really led the way for the university in faculty relationships having to do with rank and tenure matters. When I came to the university, Perkins was already well down the road and having very solid and demanding standards for faculty promotion and the award of tenure. Mm-hmm. And then later on, those were imported from Perkins to the rest of the university with the help of a lot of faculty from Perkins like you. Mm-hmm. And I can't count how many rank and tenure committees in the School of Humanities and Sciences you have sat on, largely in the 70s, yep, because I got you into it.
Yeah, right. Well, as I promised you in the tail end of that phone conversation, I would look up my annual reports to the dean of what I had done in the way of service to the university generally in those years, and I was astounded to find how many ad hoc committees, both decanal and provostal, I had served on in those years. But it was important service because it was something that we could do because we had well-developed traditions here, and as I know you know, that makes a lot of difference in the quality of a university.
Well, it does indeed, and it was very important to have Perkins faculty who were experienced in these procedures sprinkled into the ad hoc committees, mm-hmm, that were being learned about, if you will, right, elsewhere in the university, and I was very grateful for those contributions. And this is an opportunity to thank you and your colleagues publicly.
Well, thank you.
There were other committee activities, and I remember you alluded earlier to the search committee that found Jim Kirby after Joe Quillian retired. Mm-hmm. And that committee, I think you were on it, John Deschner was on it, Vic Furnish was on it, mm-hmm, and it was, I think, was chaired by Alan Coleman, wasn't it?
That was exactly right. And at that time, there was a pattern, as you will remember, that a dean from another school, right, chairs in search for a dean. Yeah. And
we had quite a turnover in deans at that time, and we almost wore Alan Coleman out because he was superb at that kind of activity.
Right. He was a splendid chairperson for something like that. That's right.
Because he himself was very broad in his interest, yep, and very Catholic in his tastes and values.
Yes.
But I remember several things in connection with that search, one of which goes back to your conversation a little earlier about the relations with the church. Mm-hmm. One of the duties of the provost at that time anyway was to attend all of the faculty, all of the board committees, trustee committees having to do with the academic area. And so I met regularly with the Perkins trustee committee, which was populated almost 100% by bishops. Mm-hmm. And I remember during that period of time, a bishop who shall remain nameless insisting that all of the candidates be brought to that committee for approval. And I assured him that they would have their opportunity for input, but that this was a university appointment and it would be made through regular university. Well, that produced a bit of a commotion, and two of our departed bishop friends, Ken Pope and Gene Slater, who were marvelous human beings, got me aside afterwards and said, "Now, Jim, don't worry about it. We will take care of him." I never knew what take care of meant.
Yeah, that's right.
In any event, we ended up with Jim Kirby, and that has proved to be, as you said, a happy appointment.
Right.
Now, you had one other important activity before we run out of time. I want to talk because in many ways, while you've done a lot of significant things, this was terribly important for the future of the university, and that was finding Don Shields' successor as president of the university. Mm-hmm. Why don't you were on the committee? Mm-hmm. Why don't you talk about it and a little bit about the committee and your role in it?
Yeah, well, it was in all sorts of ways an unforgettable experience to be a member of the search committee that brought in a report recommending the appointment of Kenneth Pye as the president of the university. This was memorable for all sorts of reasons, but most especially because of the leadership of the committee. Its chair was Ray Hunt, who was in that role, and it's the only one in which I really have known him as a person. In that role, he was as effective as I can imagine anybody being. His vision of the need for the highest quality in leadership in the university, and his determination to provide that and to search until we were satisfied that, by we here I mean not just he, but that those of us that he had asked to join him in this as members of the search committee were also satisfied that this was the leader we needed and wanted. His determination to see that through to the end was unfailing. And I will always be indebted to the model that I saw him set of what it means to work as a trustee. Very much aware of the point that our wonderful old friends, bishops, were willing to help their colleague understand. That is, that for all of the close relationship between the university and the church, and that can never be overstressed. Nevertheless, the university serves the church best when it's free to do its proper business. And that means right down to the nitty-gritty of making academic appointments. And in the instance of the appointment of Kenneth Pye, as it turned out, just as by happenstance, though this I think some Methodist bishops had trouble believing, Kenneth Pye was a devout Roman Catholic. And I can remember a bishop having been reported as having said, I did not hear him say it myself, but surely you could have found one Methodist who and the answer that he got from our chair was, well, we did not find one Methodist. We found the man that we were confident is the man that we should recommend. So there was a marvelous independence on the part of the committee, but there was also a deep sense of responsibility, and that was felt both vis-a-vis the campus community, faculty. We tried to hold open hearings and to share as much as we could with what we were doing and to solicit as much as we could from others. And there was then also a chance given all along for trustees and for members of the leadership of the church to let us know what their thinking was on all of these things. Anyway, I mean, it was just a great experience. And for me, I mean, I learned more in the period of time doing that than I probably did about anything else. On the other hand, I was able to bring to it all of this past, all of these other searches and all of these other rank and tenure tasks, and all of that played off into this division. And I think part of what made it work is that Ray Hunt, for his part, wanted a strong faculty vice chair. He wanted somebody in that chair who would do what he was supposed to do. And he gave me absolute freedom to do that, and I exercised it.
Well, I think we're fortunate in that committee to have the chair and the vice chair occupied by the individuals who did that, because that was such a critical time for the university. We'd been through the awful period of the football scandal and Don Shields' very unceremonious departure, right, and all of that, and the university needed to heal, and you realized that the way to heal was to go out and do a first-class job of finding a new president, and you did that. And we're all in your debt.
Yeah, and if I may, if we've got a minute,
sure.
I just one comment about that man, because one of the things that I think endeared him to those of us who met him for the first time and interviewed him was the absolute clarity of mind that he had about wanting to take care of his own problems. He did not, he said about the football scandal, he says, don't worry about cleaning it up before I come, if I come. I would rather clean up and live with my own mistakes than to have to deal with a hasty made decision by somebody else. Yeah. Now I'll never forget Ray Hunt's eyes when he heard that. I mean, that said, here's somebody who's prepared Of course, he had had a lot of experience dealing with Duke's problems.
Yes.
But nonetheless, it was the sense that here was somebody who was willing to lead. And that's what we needed, was leadership, in that matter as in other matters of importance.
And to take hold and move ahead.
Right.
And he certainly accomplished that.
That's exactly the kind of person he was.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Schubert, we've come to the end of what has been, for me, a very pleasant hour, and I appreciate very much your making the effort to be here. You've come from Colorado, and we're very pleased to have been able to work this out.
I certainly am too, Jim. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.